This week on Dialogue, the Latino Electorate and the 2010 Census. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Milewski. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Now let's meet our guests. Andrew Seeley is director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute and is an adjunct professor for Johns Hopkins University. Gary Segura is professor of political science at Stanford University and director of Chicano Studies for the Center for Comparative Studies of Race and Ethnicity. Matt Barreto is an associate professor of political science at the University of Washington and director of the Washington Institute for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. Mike and Gary also are principals, or Matt and Gary, I should say, are also principals with the polling firm Latino Decisions, which provides political decision makers with independent data on the impact of the Latino vote. Gentlemen, welcome to the discussion. Thanks for joining us. Let me start off with just some background on Latino Decisions. I gave a little blurb right from the website on describing what it is, but give us a little more background. What is the
well, Gary and I are both, as you mentioned, professors of political science. We both have been focusing on Latino public opinion and voting patterns in our professional academic work. We were doing lots and lots of surveys, and about 5 years ago, we launched a polling firm to specifically focus on and provide some good, objective, scientific approaches to polling Latinos and trying to bring those to Washington, D.C. to inform the D.C. debate on Latino public opinion.
And Gary, you've been making the rounds here in D.C. Who are some of the groups that are most interested in this data?
Well, with the growth of the Latino electorate and the growth of the Latino population overall, almost everyone is now interested in what's reshaping the face of America. So obviously the administration and both political parties have a vested interest in understanding what it is that Latinos want from politics, what they believe about politics, and how they want to act. Organizations from the right, the center, and the left are very interested in shaping that debate. And so people come to us frequently to ask us what we know about, from our surveys, about what Latinos are focusing on as they consider politics and choices in front of them.
And Andrew, why don't you give us the blurb on the Mexico Institute as well, so our viewers and listeners are clued in to everybody's background.
Sure. We are part of the Woodrow Wilson Center. We do work on U.S.-Mexico relations, and we've had a particular interest working with Rob Donnelly here at the center and a number of colleagues, David Ayon and Jonathan Fox and others, looking at Latino immigrants in the United States as well. We started working on Mexican immigrants, realized that you can't really separate out Mexican immigrants from other Latino immigrants, and so just finished a study last year looking at civic and political participation of Latino immigrants in the United States in 9 cities around the country.
Great. Well, gentlemen, I want to start with sort of what you found surprising about the census of 2010. Certainly that Latino populations are growing is not a surprise. I think it was at 1998 where this notion of the browning of America was introduced as phraseology. And so that trend continues. But what do people need to know that doesn't follow a straight line? Were there any surprises?
Yeah, I think, if you look at past census results, there was this overwhelming growth of the Latino population that was really driven by immigration. Today's census results, the 2010 census, tell us that actually the Latino population is now growing mostly from U.S. births, from the domestic population, as opposed to the immigrant population. The immigrant population is still there, still very important, and it is growing. But this is not an overwhelmingly foreign-born population anymore. There's a very large segment foreign-born in the United States, but the Latino population is an American population, is a U.S.-born population as well.
Gary, what would you pull out from the data?
I would echo that and go a step further. The implications of that finding are that virtually all, the numbers close to 90% now, of Latinos under the age of 18 living in the United States are native-born citizens of the United States. Now, what that means is that the size of the Latino electorate over the next 18 years will essentially double, even if not a single additional immigrant crosses the international frontier, not a single immigrant here naturalizes to U.S. citizenship. So the Latino presence in the American electorate is already exploding, and it is about to break out even more substantially.
This certainly flies in the face of a lot of perceptions about how immigrant populations grow.
That's true, and actually, despite all the heated rhetoric about illegal immigrants streaming across the border, in fact, we've seen a net reduction in illegal immigration to the United States over the past 2 to 3 years. We've actually seen more people leaving the country than coming in. From Mexico and Central America, it's about stable. There's about 200,000 people coming in from Mexico, about 200,000 leaving a year. But in fact, what was at one time a high number of people coming without documents across the borders actually slowed and stopped. I mean, we're actually not talking about a growth. People are coming legally to this country. Obviously, people who have naturalized are bringing family members. So there is some immigration from around the world, not only from Latin America, from the whole world. But we are seeing, as they pointed out, as Gary and Matt pointed out, we really are seeing a growth of the native-born population, Latino population, much more than what we were seeing 10 years ago.
Let's, before we look forward to the next elections and what this growing, aging, but youthful population will start to do, let's take a look back on previous elections. You provided a slide from Latino Decisions that talks about how decisive the Latino vote was in a couple of elections. Tell us what we see. This is, our viewers are seeing this now.
Well, if you go to the 2010 election, towards the end of that election, it really became obvious that the Latino electorate was going to be very influential in a lot of Western states where the Latino population is very strong. And as we know, the Senate, control of the U.S. Senate came down to just a couple of contests. If a couple of more Democratic senators had lost, the Republicans might control both houses in the Congress. And so what we found through some Latino Decisions election eve polling was that in Nevada, in Colorado, and in California, the Latino vote was so decisive, it was so in favor of the Democratic candidates, and their share of the electorate was so large that it accounted for the entire margin of victory. And this was in a year that the overall electorate was really trending Republican. And this was absolutely not the case for the Latino vote in these three Western states.
California is particularly striking. Barbara Boxer, plus 10.1 margin of victory, and she won by 9.8%.
Yeah, people don't always think about California as
one of my frustrations has frequently been that people say Latino voters don't matter in California because it's such a wildly Democratic state. And my answer is you've got the arrow of causation backwards. That California is a Democratic state precisely because Latino voters matter. Prior to 1994, prior to the re-election of Pete Wilson, et cetera, the 1992 presidential election, California voted for Bill Clinton, but that was the first time California's electoral votes had been cast for a Democrat in every presidential election since the Second World War, with the sole exception of the Goldwater debacle in 1964. They had had two Democratic governors in the post-war era, both of whom had last names of Brown. That literally, California was a reliably Republican state. In 1992, Bill Clinton breaks through. In 1994, Pete Wilson manages to be reelected in the shifting demography by targeting immigrants. And as a consequence, between 1994 and 2000, about 1.1 million people registered to vote in California, and 1 million of the 1.1 million were self-identified Latinos. So California changed, fundamentally changed as a consequence of anti-immigrant.
Well, we've isolated a couple of elections here where the Latino vote was essential to victory. But thinking beyond these states and these particular races and looking forward, how would you characterize the Latino vote in its current state? Is it essential or is it decisive?
Well, it depends on the state. It really depends on the state. And so I think we want to remind people that while we often talk about a national Latino electorate, in all of these contests, we really need to be paying attention to state by state. And so there are some places where it's less relevant. There are some places where it's essential. And so, we would want to be
What about for running for president?
Paying attention to specific states. Well, of course, the president is already paying attention to specific states. There are always national polls out there, but at the end of the day, there's only going to be about a dozen states where the campaign unfolds. And in the presidential election, we know that Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico in the Southwest are always very competitive. Florida in the Southeast, of course, will be very competitive with a large Latino population. And then you have these other states, such as North Carolina and Virginia, maybe even in Ohio, where the Latino population and the voter population is really growing. And if you have those close elections like you did in North Carolina in 2008, you could argue that the Latino electorate would be very important there as well.
So it's no longer accurate to just think about border states or states with large farming communities or things like that. You have to start looking across the entire electoral map.
That's exactly correct. And in fact, there are places that you wouldn't even sort of think about Latinos making a difference. there's good evidence to suggest that the margin of victory for Barack Obama in Indiana in 2008 was provided by Latino voters. There's a very small Latino population in Indiana, but the percentage that turned out and the distribution of their vote suggests that that's a margin of victory. So you can't ignore Latinos in Pennsylvania or Ohio on the assumption that, gee, it's a small group. If the race is close, every group matters. And back to your question about what's essential, what's pivotal, there's a painful underlying truth in American party politics, and that is that we are polarized on racial dimensions. And over 9 out of every 10 Republican votes come from an Anglo. And by contrast, the Democrats are essentially unelectable in most constituencies without significant vote from African Americans, Latinos, and for that matter, other racial and ethnic minorities. In 2008, in the most favorable environment ever for Democrats, 2 unpopular wars, an economy off a cliff, an incumbent Republican president with a 24% approval rating, the Republican nominee won 55% of the white vote. The Democrats have not won a majority of the white vote nationally since 1964.
Wow, that's significant. Andrew, you began by talking about the fact that the Mexico Institute could not just isolate Mexico immigrants, had to look at the broader picture of Latino immigration. Let's start breaking down the monolith. You know, I think in media shorthand and in political shorthand, we group people in these neat, tidy boxes as if it's completely descriptive. Let's, all of us together, and we begin with you, Andrew, start breaking down the monolith of this notion of a Latino electorate. How diverse is it? How can we talk about it as monolithic as far as its predictability? You know, there are things like, for instance, on the African American electorate, where there have been a predominant preference for Democratic candidates. Let's do some comparison here and help people figure this out.
Well, about 2/3 of the Latino vote, and my colleagues can correct me here, but it is Mexican descent. The rest is scattered around Puerto Rican, Salvadoran, Cuban descent. I mean, all sorts of, anywhere you can find of Latin America. And actually with very different voting patterns in some cases. And obviously the big exception to the rule of Latinos trending Democratic has always been Florida, though there's some signs that's changing. Cuban-American vote in Florida, not necessarily in New Jersey and New York, but in Florida
has been very conservative
traditionally. Now, Florida is becoming more diverse also. I mean, increasingly we're seeing people from Central America, from other parts of Latin America, in Florida, and so that vote is changing, and Cuban Americans are changing as well. But it's a very diverse population. And I wanted to mention something going back a little bit further. The one person in the Republican Party who found a way of breaking this in a consistent way, both in the state elections in Texas and nationally, was George Bush, was 43. I mean, who really was actually able to reach out and win a significant percentage of the Latino vote in national elections, and he did well also in the Texas state elections. There are Republicans. Jeb Bush did very well, not only with Cuban Americans, but with other Latino voters in Florida as well. I mean, there are Republicans that have done well with Latino voters who have actually paid attention to the Latino vote, who have really reached out in a different way. We haven't seen it as much in the past few years. There's been much more of an anti-immigrant debate that seemed to take over much of the tenor of the party. But there is a history of Republicans actually reaching out and trying to win over Latino voters as well.
But some of the conventional wisdom on this is that the party blew it when it came to George W. Bush, that if they'd followed his lead, they'd have better standing now among Latino voters.
I think that's probably true. I mean, and there really is a debate in the soul of the Republican Party right now. There are people who think that's the way to go. I'm not sure we're going to see that in 2012, but we could. There are some Republicans that are saying if we lose the close states, if we lose, not just New Mexico, but maybe Indiana or Virginia, also Virginia, by the way, heavily Salvadoran American vote, for example. If we start losing that, if we don't reach out to those communities, well, we could actually lose the presidential election again. That probably won't be fully resolved in the next couple of years, though.
Gary, what about this notion of predictability when you talk about a distinct electorate? Is the Latino electorate predictable?
Well, all electorates are predictable at some level.
Level, sure.
But
spoken like a pollster.
Yes, that's my job. But with a much larger confidence interval, I would say. So if we look at the behavior of the African American electorate, for much of the 70s, 80s, early 90s, they were hovering in the 87, 89% Democratic. They've gotten more Democratic in recent years. That's a very solid group. When we look at whites, we talk about a group that's been somewhere between 54 to 60% Republican on a very stable basis for the last couple of decades, in fact. When you look at Latinos, there's a much bigger swing ratio, I think. A fair estimate of George W. Bush's two-party vote share of Latinos in 2004 was about 38 to 40%. The exit poll number of 44% was a problem, and I think Warren Matofsky acknowledged that. But still, 38 to 40%, we estimate that Barack Obama got about 70%, maybe even slightly more than that. The exit poll said 67 to 68. We think
You think it's higher?
We think it's higher. And so that's a 10 percentage point swing, and that's a substantial swing, something that you do not observe among African Americans and you do not observe among whites. And so you would think that a group that does have that level of a swing ratio would have both political parties trying to compete for it. And I think the real mystery is why, after George W. Bush and ironically even Karl Rove's leadership on this went in one direction, the rest of the team didn't come along.
Yeah, the numbers you describe almost, to me, I keep thinking that Latinos are the new independents. I mean, they're the decisive block in many of these
We don't want to
races.
overstate that, because I think you've got, if you look over the last 2 decades, you've got about a 2/3 committed Democratic vote. George W. Bush drove that down to maybe just 60%, but still 60%, that's a solid vote. But there is a group, there's maybe 10 to 12% of the Latino population who I think could swing, and that's a larger group than you find in many other.
Matt, another question about these voting blocks is, do they actually show up at the polls? What do we know about that?
Well, that's a good follow-up question to this, because it's not just the two-party vote choice, but it's what percentage of people are going to show up on election day. And so it could be, in the case in 2010, that one of the reasons that the Latino vote appeared to be so overwhelmingly Democratic, and this would represent another swing that Gary's talking about, in states going up to 80, 85, even 90% in Nevada, was a turnout issue, that those Republican and conservative-leaning Latinos felt a little bit more alienated in this climate, in direct contrast to the rest of the electorate, where the Tea Party and conservative forces really felt empowered. Because of the rhetoric on immigration and other issues, those conservative Latinos may not have voted, and so turnout is an absolute a critical factor here. As the Latino population grows, they're going to become more influential, but turnout will always be the question. If there's a very large turnout, that means the Latino population will be even more influential, and how they swing those.
How is that trending?
Well, it varies. In 2010, we have data going back to our tracking poll that early on in the summer and other times, Latinos were very disillusioned with the Democratic Party, extremely upset with the Republican Party. And so there was a question as to whether or not there would be a big turnout. At the end of the day, we saw a very high turnout in places like Nevada, in places like Arizona, where immigration had become a wedge issue. And you had candidates in Nevada like Harry Reid, who really did try to promote and reach out to the Latino electorate. And so in other states where it was less relevant, turnout may not have been as high. And so that's something that does vary. The electoral context is extremely important. And whether or not the parties are doing outreach. The parties need to get out there and knock on doors, and they don't always do that.
Let's say you all mentioned immigration. Look, if we were going to say what are the top 5 issues that are relevant here, I think that 1, 2, and 3 are immigration. So let's take a look at a couple of the slides you provided, and you can tell us what they tell us about this issue. Here's the first.
Well, this is from a poll that we conducted in Arizona, right out on the heels of SB 1070 in the spring of 2010. And the interesting thing that this shows, we asked a question of, do you think Latinos who are legal immigrants or who are U.S. citizens are going to be stopped and targeted by police, or is this SB 1070 bill only for the undocumented? And you can see overwhelmingly Latinos were concerned that this is going to be likely that this will occur. But the interesting thing about this slide and our finding was that we found that this happened into the U.S. born generations, second generation, whose parents are immigrants, but then even into the third and fourth and further generations, which are very prominent in the Southwest, that this became an issue where immigration hadn't always been salient for those third and fourth generation Latinos who didn't identify as much. After 1070 passed, it shot up and it became salient across generational bounds, and that was a really, really significant thing that we hadn't seen in a long time.
And I think this raises the central question of why the GOP has struggled to get this right over the last 20 years. And that is that they believe, many GOP leaders believe, that they can separate Latino from immigrant. And while that's true, there are many U.S.-born Latinos who are voters and whatnot. Because of the recency and the ongoing nature of that migration, if you look in the census, you will calculate that somewhere in the neighborhood of 85 to 88% of all Latinos in the United States are either foreign-born, U.S.-born to foreign-born parents, or have at least one foreign-born grandparent. So when you're targeting immigrants and denigrating immigrants, you're talking about grandma.
Family members, yeah, yeah.
Or at best, you're talking about grandparents, and maybe you're talking about parents or the U.S. citizens
Although
themselves.
you certainly can, the GOP strategy that you've identified certainly can work over time. You see other past immigrant populations who will be anti-immigrant, forgetting their immigrant roots.
That may well be the case, but unlike all past waves of immigration, which largely stopped with the closure of Ellis Island and the restrictive policies in the early 1920s, Latino migration is ongoing. So even if you're a second, third, or even fourth generation Latino, that doesn't mean that your neighbors aren't foreign born, or that your daughter isn't married to a foreign born boy, or your daughter isn't married to the son of foreign born parents. So the number of familial connections, the number of mixed status families is actually quite large.
Here's another slide. How important was the issue of immigration in your decision to vote, and who to vote for in this election?
Well, what we found, was that the economy was a top issue in 2010. We're not going to overstate that. Latinos did care very much about the economy. They wanted to see jobs in the economy mentioned by candidates and some action taken there. But when we asked them separately, well, was immigration also an issue? Because it did show up as the number 2 issue in our poll. Over 60% said it was one of the most important issues that brought me to the polls today. It's a symbolic issue. It has real appeal, the way that it was discussed. And only 14% of Latinos, only 14% said no, immigration wasn't really that important to me.
Are there other issues of note that we should mention that are important to this voting bloc? When we obviously immigration is critical, but what else?
Well, you both have polled on this, but I mean, if you look at what Latino voters want, I mean, it's a lot of the same things that every voter wants in the United States. It's good education, it's safe communities, it's good health care. I mean, those issues are up there. What's happened is as the debate has become so acrid against immigrants and against Latino immigrants in particular, it's become a real symbolic issue. I mean, it's not clear that Latinos go to the polls necessarily to vote for immigration reform, to vote for a specific bill, but they do go to the polls. I mean, it's a symbolic issue when people start demonizing immigrants. And there's an undertone also. I mean, many communities, particularly where local legislation has been passed or discussed to penalize immigrants, I mean, quite often it is the heated tone of the debate really becomes a racial debate. I mean, it becomes a debate not just about immigrants, but about the changing character of the community, about Latinos, about music, about food, about language. And I remember a conversation that was very marked in my mind in one community near D.C. The gentleman was talking to me, said, I'm Puerto Rican. I was born and raised in New York, and I'm an ex-Marine. And for the first time in my life, and I've lived in this community for 30 years, and for the first time in my life, I don't feel welcome in this community. And I think that's the undertone of something, more than immigration being, it's not a policy debate in the same way that education policy is. It's a symbolic issue because it demonizes an entire community of people.
So there's no recovery for the
It's not just
GOP
grandma.
that doesn't involve immigration. There aren't other issues that they can use as to score political points.
I think that's a significant problem for them, yes. So when Cruz Bustamante became Speaker of the California Assembly, the first Latino speaker in the modern era, he was fond of running around California saying the Latino agenda is the American agenda. Education, crime.
The things that Andrew was
jobs,
just listing.
Exactly. Okay. I think many Latino leaders would love to see the issue of immigration be done with so that they could get back to the real work, which would be doing things like improving schools, dealing with safe communities, making college accessible to minority youth. Those are the things, I think, that would be of real interest. Now, the GOP has often believed that it had a secret weapon, and that secret weapon was social conservatism. That is, Latinos are stereotypically religiously observant, anti-abortion, perhaps more conservative on gay rights. The problem is, in any survey we have run, social moral issues never appear more than 2% of the population saying that that's their most important issue. That's just not the voting issues for most Latinos.
Show another slide you brought along here, the Sharon Angle anti-Latino ad. And if you take a quick mention of what we're seeing, and what I'm really interested in is how much damage does an ad campaign like this create nationally, beyond the state that it ran in?
This is an excellent point, because the Arizona SB 1070 bill did the same thing. It wasn't just in Arizona that Latinos were upset about this. They were upset about this nationally. And when the Sharon Angle ad was running in the Nevada election, it was getting coverage on Univision, on Spanish language radio, Spanish newspaper, and talked about in Latino circles nationally. And if you look at some of the clips from the ad, it's a clear attempt to conflate Latino immigrants with criminal gangsters, with thugs, with people, and to juxtapose that against the good white families in Nevada who are now scared And it was so over the top with those racial tones that
The waves of illegal aliens language too. It's invasion of the body snatchers. It's really over the top.
and it was really one of the nastiest ads we've seen in a very long time. That is going to have repercussions for Republicans. They're going to have to answer whether
And
they support that.
the visuals from the ad were also used in a David Vitter ad in Louisiana.
Oh.
So the same thugs who were terrorizing families in Nevada were trying to get into in-state
Very mobile
college
thugs. Very
in Louisiana. It's like it was over the top.
Well, you know, for Republicans and Democrats, it comes down to this next slide, this electoral map that we're looking at right now. And really, if the Democrats now have the momentum with the Latino vote, the question is which red states can turn blue? What does the map show us?
Well, the first focus for the Latino electorate is going to continue to be on those 3 states in the Southwest and Florida. So Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, and Florida. This is really the Latino battleground states where you're going to see a very vigorous campaign, not just to win the Latino vote, but to get them out to the polls. And so I think that's the first starting point that we need to be looking at in 2012.
I think that's correct, and I think as this map indicates, if we take a conservative approach, we would assume North Carolina, Virginia, and Indiana switch back into the Republican column, making those other states much more conservative. By the way, I'm not willing to bet that North Carolina and Virginia necessarily have to go back, but if you take a conservative approach, that means that these states are going to be very critical for Democrat electability. And I think the other thing is the changing demography in Florida, which Andrew referred to briefly. In our polling, Marco Rubio got 78% of Cuban vote, but only 40% from non-Cuban Latinos. And Cubans are now a minority of registered Latino voters in Florida and only about 35% of the Latino population in Florida. So the situation there is actually shifting, and shifting in a way that benefits Democrats.
Well, gentlemen, this is a fascinating discussion. I wish we had more time for it. We can check your website. What is the website?
LatinoDecisions.com.
Okay, great. And of course, wilsoncenter.org to find Andrew and all his fine work at the Mexico Institute. Thanks again, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.